Well, welcome to the Encephalitis International podcast. Today, we explore the world of memory and its intersection with encephalitis. I'm thrilled to have with me today Professor Jonathan Evans, who's a distinguished expert in clinical neuropsychology. Following his training in Wessex, Professor Evans moved in 1991 to work at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge, and in 1996 became the founding clinical director of what was then one of our favourite rehabilitation centres in the UK, now sadly closed, but the Oliver Zangwill Centre for Neuropsychological Rehabilitation in Ely. In October 2003, he moved to his current position at the University of Glasgow, where, amongst other things, he's the programme director for the MSc in clinical neuropsychology. Professor Evans' research interests include the assessment and rehabilitation of disorders of memory, attention, and executive functioning, and the application of new technology in cognitive rehabilitation and the treatment of mood disorder. As many of our community know, memory challenges are a common and often very frustrating consequence of encephalitis, and Professor Evans's work in memory rehabilitation and cognitive disorders can offer us some valuable insights that could make a real difference in the lives of those that have been affected by encephalitis or indeed a brain injury from other causes. So whether you're a patient, a healthcare professional, researcher, or simply curious about the inner workings of the human mind, this conversation promises to shed some light on the complexities of memory and the innovative approaches that are being developed to support people who've been affected by memory difficulties. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Encephalitis Podcast, Jon.
Thanks very much, Ava. Delighted to be here.
Well, there's a beautiful view of Glasgow behind you, I have to say. It's the famous Byres Road, isn't it?
Indeed it is. Yes, a beautiful day, a beautiful blue sky here in Glasgow this morning.
Fantastic. Well, we'll dive straight into some of the questions. I mean, I'm curious, what inspired you to get into research into memory?
Several things. I guess I was really fortunate in my training in clinical psychology to have Professor Barbara Wilson as one of my supervisors and mentors. And, that was many, many decades ago. And we're still colleagues, friends today. And as you're aware, Barbara has been one of the most influential clinicians and researchers in the area of memory and memory rehabilitation. So that was inspiring learning from her. But I guess probably most importantly, it was actually just meeting people with memory impairment, including very severe memory impairment and amnesic syndrome, and including people who had suffered from encephalitis. So I think just learning from people and understanding how a memory impairment impacted people in their day-to-day lives, that was really my inspiration.
Yeah, we met a long time ago. I really can't remember. I don't think either of us can remember how long ago it was now. But tell us a little bit, how does encephalitis affect memory and cognition? How does the memory become impacted?
Well, one of the things about memory, in a sense, is almost all parts of the brain are involved in memory in different ways. And so anybody with virtually any neurological or even psychological condition actually quite often experiences some difficulties with memory. That could be with short-term memory or long-term memory, and we'll perhaps come on to that in a moment. But obviously for some people with encephalitis, there are certain structures in the brain which are especially important for memory, and particularly for learning new information and remembering what's happened and so on. And those are we refer to those as the medial temporal lobes, so the middle of the temporal lobes, which sit in a sense on the side of the brain there. And those structures, such as the hippocampus, as perhaps we think of as one of the key structures, we know that when these are damaged or affected by something like encephalitis or different types of encephalitis, that can make it really difficult to remember things that have happened and therefore to learn new things. Somebody may be able to remember things from the past quite well, but not find it easy to learn new things. And so encephalitis is one of those conditions that for some people can really affect those parts of the brain, and which we know are so important for memory.
Well, you mentioned there short and long-term memory. What's the difference between those, and how can an injury to the brain, whether it's from encephalitis or a road traffic accident or whatever it might be, how can a brain injury affect them?
So yeah, so these are sort of tricky terms because psychologists often use them in a slightly different way to sometimes how that they're used more generally. So when we talk about short-term memory, we often use the term working memory, because what we mean about that is it's that ability to hold and manipulate information in mind. All right, so just temporarily or briefly. So the classic example of that is trying to remember a phone number. So somebody gives you their mobile number and you're going to type it into your phone. So that ability just to hold information, to rehearse it and to manipulate it, if you like, long enough so that you can write it down or type it in. That's what we refer to as a short-term memory or working memory. Contrast that with long-term memory. Essentially, long-term memory is everything else we remember. So the striking thing about that is it could be remembering what you had for breakfast just this morning, maybe a couple of hours ago, through to remembering your first memories as a child. So that a lifetime of memory. So everything that we store and retain over time, we would call long-term memory. And that could, things that are relatively recent, what you did at the weekend, a holiday, the last holiday, as I said, to more factual information as well. So your knowledge of the world is also memory. It's information you've learned. We tend to call that semantic memory. So where you've learned a particular fact, and just because you've been exposed to that over many, many years. So we make that distinction between episodic information or episodic memory, so memory for events and experiences, birthday parties, weddings, holidays, compared to factual information. These are two different types of memory, but they're very much related.
Can you tell us, sometimes we hear about false memories. Can you tell us what a false memory is? And is there a rule for caregivers or professionals as to how you should respond to someone who might have false memories?
Yeah, so one of the terms we sometimes use for false memory is confabulation, the sort of technical term, if you like. And I guess what we mean there is where somebody is remembering something or believing something that they think might have happened, for example, but which didn't happen. And when we think about confabulation, we can talk about it in a variety of ways or different types of confabulation. So sometimes somebody may, in a sense, be mixing up real memories or parts of real memories or two events that might have actually happened, but the person is not really remembering them in the right order or how they relate to each other, or just sort of blending them. Other times somebody may, for example, have thought something or imagined something, or something has come to mind, and actually they then believe that might have happened rather than it being something that was imagined. And of course that can be particularly distressing, because somebody may have imagined that something bad has happened, or that can be distressing. And obviously these situations where the person really feels that it feels like a memory. So for the person who's experiencing that, of course they believe it because it feels like a normal memory. It feels how memory feels. But that person is unable to make that sort of judgment or distinction between when something happened, whether or not it happened, whether it was imagined. So for the person experiencing that, like I said, it's very real. But of course, then for families or professionals trying to help that person, that's difficult, because the temptation is to sort of challenge or to question. And I guess the advice is often to sort of, in a way, to avoid confrontation. Now, that doesn't always mean that can be difficult, because it doesn't mean that it means sort of going along with a memory. But often, particularly as people are still getting used to or learning that their memories may not be always correct, that's a difficult phase. So confrontation is probably not the easiest way. Sometimes one has to, in a way, just sort of acknowledge, or gently sort of move on to something else, and distract sometimes. And I guess what we've tend to find is it's one of those things that over time one needs to try and help somebody to come to understand that not all memories that they have might be accurate, but that takes a lot of time. It often needs a bit of professional support for that process, because within a family context that can be difficult to do, and it takes a lot of time. We certainly had some success with people just very gently learning about memory and how it works. So over time, trying to enable somebody to become a bit more expert in their memory. But again, people who are experiencing confabulation often have poor memories, and so actually learning that takes a lot of time and a lot of repetition. But finding a way of thinking about their memory and how it might go wrong is perhaps what we tend to encourage. But I know that it's a really difficult one for families, and it's one of the hardest things to try and manage in day-to-day life.
One of the questions I didn't ask you, and I perhaps should have done at the beginning for everybody that's listening, is what is the neuropsychologist and what do they do?
Well, yeah, so most neuropsychologists, I guess, are clinical psychologists who are specializing in neuropsychology. And so I guess most of us have trained in clinical psychology, or if you work with children, you may have come from an educational psychology background. But most clinical neuropsychologists are clinical psychologists, and then developing specialist knowledge and skills in the area of neuropsychology. And so I guess we are interested in how brain, cognition, emotion, and behavior all interact. So we primarily work with people with neurological conditions. That could be encephalitis, brain injury, stroke, dementia, and so on, and all the whole range of neurological conditions and injuries. And then thinking about mental functions, so things like memory and concentration and language and problem solving and so on. But also psychological or emotional functions, mood, and how they interact with cognition, and how that impacts on people's day-to-day life. So we're particularly interested in understanding, so doing assessments and understanding people, but then also supporting people with rehabilitation to try and manage their cognitive difficulties and their emotional difficulties in day-to-day life.
Well, tell us a little bit about some of the kinds of tools that might help people with memory problems. What's out there? What's available?
Well, I suppose I tend to emphasize the great range of memory aids. So when we think about memory tools, obviously one approach we take is to use and encourage people to make the effective use of memory aids. So that can be, and we all of us use memory aids in our day-to-day lives, and that becomes more important if your memory is impaired. So those can be low-tech solutions. So it could be notebooks or diaries, or sometimes like a whiteboard or a calendar in the kitchen, or a dossier box for managing your medication. So there are a variety of those, what we might call the lower tech solutions, but also increasingly we've got what you might call higher tech or tech solutions. So with using phones as reminding tools, many people now will have a smart speaker, so Alexa or Google Home, and actually those can be used as well. My colleague, Professor Narinder Kapoor, has produced some really nice guidebooks actually to using things like Alexa and Google Home for people with brain injury and also people with dementia. So the tech is useful, and certainly that over the years, that's one of the things I've been particularly interested in, as you know, going back a couple of, well, actually to the early sort of 1990s, really. We worked on a bit of tech called NeuroPage, which was using pages. Feels somewhat archaic and old school now, but actually it was a great little approach, really, where people with memory impairments were supported by wearing a pager and getting reminders about things they wanted to do at the right time, with a beep and a vibrate and the message. So the beauty of that was that it was a really sort of simple simple thing. You wore it on your belt or in your pocket. It just delivered a message and alerted you, actively prompted you. So it was a great little bit of tech, and we evaluated that and showed that it was really useful for people with memory impairment. Now, obviously, the technology has moved on, and we all have smartphones in our pockets, and actually, so we've got the potential to use those for helping us, particularly with what we call prospective memory, so remembering to do things, because one of the big challenges for prospective memory is that sort of remembering at the right time, or so you need to be actively prompted to do that. And we've been working in developing apps to help people with memory impairment, and so currently working with some really great colleagues at a small startup called NewMind, so who are developing an app that's really designed for people to support people with brain injury in a variety of different ways, but including particularly with remembering. So I think the tech side is a great, there's a great range of things, and I think we need to make better use of that over time. In our work in a clinical context, but there are also tools or techniques, if you like, or strategies, such as how we help people to maximize their learning. So over the years, I mentioned Barbara Wilson earlier on. So Barbara and myself and others have looked at what we call errorless learning, and that's just a learning technique which is about how you help people to try to learn new things, but by minimizing the number of sort of errors people make along the way. Because what we know is that if you've got a very severe memory impairment, if you make a mistake while you're learning something, the problem is that can be sort of sealed in a little bit, and so you keep making the same mistake. So a variety of different studies have suggested that if we can help people to minimize the mistakes they make whilst they're learning something new, that can actually help to sort of make that learning more efficient and effective. So we've got a variety of ways. We've got sort of learning on using what we know about how memory works and how it goes wrong to help us to maximize learning, but also we've got the everyday simple technologies that really support memory in day-to-day life.
Well, the world of technology, as we all know, is moving very fast, especially with regard to artificial intelligence, or as it's known, AI. Can you see AI becoming a supportive tool going forward in memory?
Yes, I mean, I think sort of getting AI tools that are integrated with some of the sort of apps and so on could potentially make those more sophisticated in terms of, for example, predicting. So let's say you have to give a message to somebody, or you have to do something in a particular place. Actually, one of the things that would be great is sort of recognizing when you're in that place and actually prompting you, or when you're with that person and prompting you. Things like face recognition, for example, and some people struggle with remembering who people are or where they are, and so actually tools to facilitate that easily. So I think there's going to be a variety of ways in which AI could be integrated within the sort of tools that we're working with already.
Sounds like there could be some exciting developments in the future. I've also heard about music as a rehabilitation tool that's been used with patients with memory impairments. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we did some work actually primarily this is people recovering from stroke actually, but I think music has the potential to be useful for people with a variety of different brain injuries or brain conditions. So music is used in many different ways. So obviously for people with dementia, music has often been used as a reminiscence tool, as a way of triggering memories. Music tends to stay with us in our memories. It's very emotional, it's evocative, and can transport you back to a particular place and so on. So I think there's that. But also what we know about music in a sense is that it can really impact our mood. It can lift your mood, it can calm you, it can relax you, and so on. So music as a tool to manage mood and emotion, which then can have a positive effect on memory and cognition, I think is a really really good use of music. What we did in our study was actually building on some work that had taken place in Finland, actually, in terms of looking at music listening after to support recovery after a stroke. And what that work did is, what we did in our study is we looked at people who were asked to each day, so fairly soon after within a week or so, a week or two of having a stroke, actually listening daily to music, just for 30 minutes to an hour, and that was people's preferred music. And they did that for about 8 weeks, and both in the studies in Finland, for example, they had compared the music listening with listening to audiobooks and just treatment as usual, and they found a beneficial effect of the music listening group on some measures of memory and concentration, and some measures of mood. And in our own study, we were curious about what might be beneficial, why that might be helping. And one of the things that we felt was that actually it may be acting through that ability to learn to concentrate, a bit like a mindfulness. I sometimes refer to it as mindfulness light. In a sense, it's not a sort of detailed meditation approach, but in a sense, we're teaching that basic mindfulness of, if you give yourself time to sit and listen to some music, you are aware your concentration might be drifting or wandering off, and actually you learn to bring your concentration back to the music. So actually you're training your attention and your concentration, enabling you to be a bit more present and in the moment. And we think that then potentially helps with your mood, and then also with your memory and concentration.
So that's good advice there. We should all be listening maybe to more music going forward.
I agree.
It's helping us in ways that we didn't even know. That was really interesting hearing about that research. Have you got any other interesting directions for your research in the coming years? So you talked about a new mind, the new app. Is there anything else?
Well, that certainly we're certainly working on that, and with my colleagues there, and yeah. So one of the things we want to do there really is to understand, I guess, what's helpful in those things, what should be in the app, and what's most helpful, and also how to help people use these sort of technologies over a longer time period. Because sometimes with a sort of these bits of tech, somebody may sort of try it for a while and but not maybe sustain that. And so we want to help people to find ways to sustain that use of those tools, and sort of put them to good use. We've built into one of the app what we call nudges, which that's been an interesting research sort of journey over the years. So again, that really goes back to prospective memory, or remembering to do things. And that's, so what we find is you could, if somebody has a particular appointment or something at a particular time, you can send them a message to do that. But often we have things that we're going to do at some point today, but not necessarily at a specific time. So over the years, we've done research on what we call delivering I call them sort of non-contingent cues or alerts, or now we call them nudges. And so what that's about really is about every now and again during a day, what we'll do is, if you've got something to do, so if you've got something to do later on, maybe it'll just pop to mind, and it keeps that intention active in your mind, so that when it gets to the right time, you're gonna buy some milk on the way home from work rather than just driving home. So that it keeps that intention active. But for people after brain injury, that doesn't seem to happen as much. It's harder to keep those intentions active. So with the apps, what we do is we just deliver a little nudge, which sort of pops up a prompt and says, hey, anything to remember, anything on your to-do list? So the idea is that it's just prompting people to take a moment to pause, just to sort of think, okay, what's on my to-do list for today, just to keep those things a bit more active, so they're more likely to be remembered when you need to do them. So that's one of the things that we're still working on.
That sounds exciting. I think I do prefer nudge to non-contingent cues. If I
Yes,
think that's what you said. Yeah, a
yeah,
nudge.
a nudge,
Um,
indeed.
well, obviously, we've all come out the other side of this COVID-19 pandemic. Were there any implications for memory as a result of COVID-19?
Yes, obviously in a variety of ways. So obviously, so for some people who experienced very severe forms of COVID-19, including respiratory distress experiences and times in hospital and ICUs, that can obviously have an impact on memory. Some people experience stroke in the context of COVID, and we've worked with people who have that problem. So obviously, there were the more sort of severe forms of COVID. But for many people also, there are people who suffer from what's been called long COVID, and where there's a small number of people experience the sort of an ongoing challenges post COVID or over the much longer period. And as part of that, one of the commonly used terms that people experience is the idea of brain fog. And obviously, brain fog is a sort of complicated term. It perhaps means different things to different people, but often it refers to that feeling of finding it hard to concentrate and to pay attention, sometimes associated with experience of fatigue and or difficulties with sleep, and perhaps directly as a result of the illness. But in terms of memory that we're focusing on today, of course, if you find it harder to pay attention and to concentrate and to focus on something, it's harder to remember it. It's harder to remember things. Our memories rely on encoding information, getting information into the memory, and that helps when you're able to be fully alert or aware and concentrating. So if you're struggling to concentrate and maintain attention, and in the context of fatigue, that can have an impact on memory as well. So certainly that's something that we certainly associate with this idea of long COVID.
It's also, I mean, I guess it sounds like outside of the context of COVID, that all of those things that people might be struggling with as a result of a brain injury could be impacting their memory. Even so, as you said, concentration, attention, the ways that people think might be impacting their capacity to remember things that, as an aside, even though the memory areas of the brain haven't been affected themselves. So it sounds very, very complex.
Yes, exactly. So if we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, really, in terms of that sort of the different types of memory, in some senses, with some conditions where we say, well, if you damage a particular part of the brain, like the hippocampus, you become very severely memory impaired. So that's a very clear memory impairment. But as we say, in order to remember, or to remember effectively or efficiently, or to learn new things, we have to be able to pay attention or to concentrate. So if you're somebody who's trying to be at work or at college or study and so on, everyone knows that need. If you're studying, for example, to try and pay attention to what you're learning, to think about what you're reading and connect it with information that we call that encoding. And the better that you can encode information, the more likely you'll remember it. But if you're struggling with fatigue, and so as a result your concentration is not good, maybe it's harder to focus, or if your mood if you're anxious or depressed, you're worried, in a sense, if much of your thoughts are taken up with worrying thoughts, in a sense there's less capacity to focus on something you're trying to do, be it at work or college or in every day. And so in that sense, memory is also affected. So these things are completely sort of interlinked. So somebody may say, my memory is poor, but actually what's happening is that it is harder to remember things because it's harder to pay attention, and it's harder to pay attention because of fatigue, of worry, of stress, and so on. So all of these things mix in.
And I guess there's other environmental things that are going to affect our memory as well, like whether we're sleeping well, what we eat and drink, those kinds of things.
Exactly. Yeah. So nutrition is definitely important. But mentioning there, sleep is obviously critical. So that's one of the things that we know. There's a really close relationship between sleep and memory. So in fact, sleep is really important for what we call consolidating memory. So that sort of holding memories, sort of being retained over a long period of time, getting memories properly, solidly in our brains, in our minds. Sleep is really important for that. And so getting good sleep is an important priority for all sorts of reasons, but including for memory. But obviously also if you're not sleeping and you're fatigued and tired, as we said, that then is going to impact on your ability to concentrate during the day, and therefore that's going to impact on your ability to remember. So yeah, sleep definitely something that we should all prioritize.
I'm curious how, as a neuropsychologist, you manage patient expectations. So in my experience, some people that I've worked with, they know that they've been referred to neuropsychology, but they don't know what that does. Then they're not sure what to expect at this consultation. And some people that I've worked with think it's going to be this miracle cure and you will fix their memory and all of these other things. So there's a huge continuum of people's expectations when they enter rehabilitation of some kind. So how do you manage patients' expectations?
Well, I think through sort of open, honest conversations. And so we talk about developing a formulation. So when I say a formulation, I mean, as part of that, working with somebody in their assessment, we're working with the person and perhaps their family as well to understand them. So the starting point is helping us understand them, but also helping the person understand themselves. And what I mean by that is understanding, what's happened to their brain, what the implications of that are, or what's happened in terms of their functioning, so mental functions like memory, and then how that impacts on their day-to-day life. So understanding the relationship between the sort of the brain, in a sense, the cognition, and then the everyday life, and yeah, and all in the round, if you like. So and the important thing is then about sharing that with that person, developing it with them, and being explicit about working together to do that, sharing it with them, with their family, checking whether that makes sense, whether that it all fits with their experiences. And then as part of that, thinking about, well, what is it that person is wanting to be doing, what matters to them. So we place a strong emphasis on thinking about what's important to the person. Now, sometimes, somebody may want to do something that's not possible. Somebody may want to go back to work or go back to college, and that's not possible because of the nature of their cognitive difficulties. So that takes time to help that person to develop an understanding of themselves. I often talk about, I think it's good for people to, in a sense, to become experts in themselves. And that takes a bit of time, but actually, I think if people have a good understanding of their own brain injury, they then, often people get a bit more confident in talking about their injury and the consequences without sometimes talk about without the emotional sting or that feeling of sort of anxiety or fear, or because there is stigma attached to having cognitive difficulties or mental difficulties. But actually, if you understand the relationship between your brain, the functions of your brain, and the functions of the parts of your brain that might have been affected by a condition like encephalitis, and then why that would make some aspects of day-to-day life more difficult. I think that, like I say, but by becoming an expert in yourself, then that sort of gives people the confidence to both understand. And then as part of that conversation, I guess it is then thinking about, well, what can we do, and what are the limits of what we can do? In a sense, what are the limits? We can't often, and more often than not, in a sense, we can't make memory, perfect again. We can't restore it to how it was before an injury. A part of the brain has been damaged, and we can't make that better. But the sort of more optimistic or positive side of that is, but we can help somebody to manage to do the things that they want to do in their day-to-day life more effectively. And sometimes that means using a memory aid, but using it effectively. So you're using that to compensate for your memory, or in conjunction with your memory. But that means you do the things that you want to do, and that can make the difference. That's an important difference. I often use the analogy in the sense of, sometimes it's easier to think about for somebody with a physical impairment. So somebody who has a spinal injury, they have an accident, a spinal injury, that person perhaps can't walk anymore, and that can be devastating. But that person wants to go back and get around the community, go to work, and so one can provide a mobility aid, so a wheelchair, and then one could provide a powered wheelchair, so a technological version of that. And I think in terms of what we're often doing in memory rehabilitation, we could think about it in the same way. So the memory is damaged, and we can't make it better at the moment, but we can provide an aid in a sense, and that aid may be a low-tech solution, like we were talking about, notebooks, diaries, and things, or a high-tech solution, so using your mobile phone effectively and so on. And what that's doing is it enables you to do the things that you want to do in your day-to-day life in the same way that somebody who uses a powered wheelchair can get about the community independently, do the things they want to do, which are important to them. So I think there's a you're right that there's it's a difficult one, because we in a sense helping people to manage those expectations, but it's about developing knowledge and expertise, and then confidence in how best to manage their own condition.
Yeah, very important. We're coming to towards the end of this podcast, so I've just got a couple more questions for you. And my first one is, what is one thing that you've learned from your research or your work that you wish more people knew about?
Well, I suppose one of the things that I'm really keen on, and having been a neuropsychologist, and is how best to make use of our knowledge of cognitive functions to actually help improve cognitive function. So I gave the example earlier on about the nudges. So that's maybe a good example whereby I think by understanding how cognition works and how it might then break down in the context of damage, that then sometimes gives us some clues as to then how to manage that and make, for example, learning or remembering more effective. And I'm quite keen that actually we do more of that, and we think of how best to use our knowledge. Now, obviously, we could say we ultimately want to try and repair brains and to make them so that we don't need to have memory aids and all the rest of it. But for quite a while, we're going to need to understand better about how cognitive functions work, how they break down, and then what that tells us about how to manage those difficulties. And I think we can do a little bit more of that, both in relation to things like memory, but also what we call the executive functions, the sort of the planning and the problem solving abilities that we all have to use in our day-to-day life. So I think that's something that I think I'm keen for people to make more use of.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. And I think the brain is the one organ that none of us ever really think about. It's about, and particularly about looking after as well. People talk about livers and kidneys and hearts, and but we forget. We're using this all the time, and yet we forget, don't we? To kind of look after ourselves, we forget.
I think you're right, and I think there is increasingly perhaps that move to think about brain health in the same way that for many years we've thought about cardiac health and that more general. And in essence, what we know is that all of the things that are good for our general health are actually good for our brain health. So even if you think your heart works well, actually, then it's a good idea to exercise and to eat well and do all the sleep and do all those sort of things that are good for your general physical health, because actually they're really good for your brain health. So yeah. Definitely remembering that's important.
Brain health. Well, in closing, is there anything that I've not asked you that you wish I'd asked you today, or anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to talk about?
No, I don't think so. I think we've been fairly comprehensive. So thank you for all your questions. I mean, I think I feel like we've still got a lot of way to go in our research in terms of helping people to manage these cognitive difficulties so that people can do the things that they want to be doing more of in day-to-day life. And so I would encourage certainly my colleagues who work in this field and everyone to sort of join that work and keep doing that. But also for people who we're always really grateful to people who have difficulties, or including people with encephalitis, to take part in research studies, to get involved, get active in those sorts of things, because actually that can be a great thing to be a part of those studies, but you're also then helping other people who might benefit from that research down the track. So definitely encouraging people, and I know that certainly many people with encephalitis do that and help research and help people in the future with these sorts of difficulties.
They do. You're absolutely right. Some important messages there. And I think we often find that, that there's a great deal of desire to get involved in research from our encephalitis community. So some important messages there to close with, Jon. Well, we've come to the end of what I think has been a fascinating conversation with Professor Evans. We hope that you've all gained some insights into the complex world of memory and its relationship with encephalitis. Thank you, Jon, for sharing your time today and your knowledge. Your expertise and passion, I think, for helping people affected by memory challenges it comes across. It's really clear. And it's also clear, I think, that the field of neuropsychology is still evolving and will be evolving rapidly. And I think this really offers hope and possibilities for our community in the hopefully not too distant future. Finally, I want to thank you, the listener, for listening, of course. Remember, when you're dealing with memory difficulties yourself, or if you're supporting someone who is, then you're not alone in this journey. Encephalitis International is here to help and support you in whatever way you need us to. So for more information, as well as our contact details, please visit our website, which is encephalitis.info. And together, hopefully, we can achieve one of our primary aims, which is reducing death and disability from encephalitis. You'll find all the information that you need in this podcast description. And as always, if you can support our work, we would be extremely grateful. So please visit encephalitis.info/donate. Thank you again, and we will see you next time on the Encephalitis International podcast.